Okay, so let's get started on this week's lecture. So this week we're departing from fiction and then we're going to be moving into our unit on poetry. And I know most students are a little resistant to study poetry. It's often seen or viewed as very difficult. We're going to sort of take it apart, look at the sort of key terms of poetry, and look at some different examples and different types of poetry. And then I'm going to get each of you to do your written assignment for this week, which is to do an explication of a poem. And the three that I've chosen, I think, are very approachable. They're not as complex as some of the ones that we'll talk about in lectures, but I think poetry is a way to express yourself, right? That is rooted in history. And when we think about like the original reasons why people wrote poetry, a lot of it has to do with sort of our connection to song. So if we think about poetry as different than song, it's sort of one of the things we can see is that it is rooted as song. It's meant to be spoken out loud, sometimes even originally written as a sort of musical expression. So we sort of differentiate between poetry and song. We love music as students, but we don't like poetry. So I think we can sort of start breaking down some of these barriers and maybe look at some examples where the message of the poets is similar to how we might sort of view today's musicians. So it's an interesting parallel. We're also going to sort of look at different types of poems. So we'll look at some love poetry, some traditional sonnets, and then we'll look at a more longer piece, a narrative poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And we'll also at first discuss some poetry key terms. So it's important to know the terminology for the type of discourse that you're dealing with. Poetry has its own sort of key terms that will become important and useful for you while you write your poetry explication, which is this week's assignment. And I'll talk about that a little later on in lectures. So we can start by thinking about what is a poem, the basic definition. And it's hard to sort of have one clear definition of what a poem is when we think of all the different sort of variations that exist. But again, it is something that began as a song and it continues to be like a song in the sense that it is best appreciated when you speak it or sing it by the human voice. And it's meant, again, there's lots of different reasons why it was written, but I think love poetry is one of the larger genres that we'll look at in our lectures. And is rooted in a sort of courtship tradition. So we'll look a little bit closer at some of these ideas as we go along. So we can start by looking at some of the key terms of poetry. The first two that I want to draw your attention to is the persona or speaker and the auditor. So the persona or speaker is just the speaker of the poem, right? It's in fiction we would call that the narrator, but in a poem we have a persona or a speaker that we differentiate from the author. So there's the author of the poem who is writing the words, and then they might create a sort of persona or person who they see as reading this poem. And you have to sort of differentiate between those two. So we would refer to the speaker of the poem or the persona when you're writing about a piece of poem or poetry. And then we also have the auditor, and this is just a term that we use to describe the person being spoken to. Usually in love poetry there is a sort of implied female love interest that is maybe off scene or that is being spoken to by the speaker. And the speaker might be trying to woo this lady through his love poem. So that's where we get sort of the traditional love poetry, that part of history, where we have sort of courtship tradition of men who would read poetry that they've written and try to sort of woo or court a lady that they were interested in. And this tradition is pretty much, we might see it sort of carried forward in sort of love songs, today's sort of popular music. So love ballads still exist today. I guess you could think of sort of contemporary examples of music where there's a male singer and he's sort of singing a love song. I don't know, maybe Justin Bieber would be the equivalent, or I don't know, another love ballad that can't think of off the top of my head, but I'm sure you guys can think of an example. But that's where poetry is also rooted, in this sort of traditional love song, right? So you think of the male speakers of the poetry, that some of the poems that we're doing, and how they are sort of addressing female love interests. So that's why they are reciting this poem, because they are trying to woo this lady into dating them. So it's rooted in this sort of traditional love song. So it's important to differentiate the type of poem that you're dealing with, and this is what we would call a poetic genre. A lot of the poems we're doing is examples. They're mostly just lyric poems, which mean they're sort of short. So most lyric poems are just sort of spoken by one single speaker, and they convey that speaker's personal emotions or feelings at the moment, and they usually use the present tense. So that's most of the examples that we're going to do. We'll also do a sonnet, which is a more sort of structured poem, and we'll discuss that as well, so what a sonnet looks like. Other types of poems, again, you can find monologues, so where there's one speaker and sort of a narrative style. An epic poem or narrative poem, like Rime of the Ancient Mariner, where you have a long, extended scene being played out, a narrative, or an ode, a ballad. So you can find a lot of different types of genres when we're discussing poetry. You're all probably familiar with haikus. So the standard structure, 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables, and I've given us a little funny example here of one. So poetry is a lot about structure and content together. So when we're looking and reading poetry, it's good to know, to be able to sort of look at a poem and be able to distinguish what type of poem this is and identify the structure. And we can do that by sort of looking at the rhyme scheme, counting syllables, and looking at it visually on the paper as well. So is it sort of organized in couplets or quatrains or lines of 3? So all this kind of stuff is also important when we're looking at a piece of poetry. One of the other key terms we can look at is hyperbole, so we'll look at a couple of examples of this. This is also in fiction as well, but a hyperbole is an overstatement, an exaggeration. The example here is when, a commonly used saying literally all the time. That would be a sort of hyperbole, hyperbolic statement. So you're not going to literally die if you stop using hyperboles incorrectly. But again, it's overstating something, so exaggerating your claims. So we'll look at examples of these key terms as we go along. So here's some examples of figurative language, and you'll have reviewed these as review from our fiction lectures as well. But two common ones would be the metaphor and the simile, and you should be able to distinguish the difference between these two. So a metaphor is a direct comparison between two unlike things, and a simile is similar to that, but it is a comparison that uses like as or than as a sort of connection between those two things that are being compared. The examples that I'm using, so I'm borrowing from popular music. This is a Katy Perry song. So like I was saying, in today's society, we don't necessarily have poetry at the forefront of our culture, but we do have music. And I think music shares many of the same and sort of continues the traditions of traditional poetry, but doing so in a sort of different genre, so doing it in a musical form. So musicians are writing the poetry of our society, I think, of our culture. So here's a Katy Perry song where she's using metaphor and simile. The example is, baby, you're a firework. Come on, show them what you're worth. Make them go ah 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 as you shoot across the sky. So in this example, we have a comparison between, well, our speaker, again, is addressing another person, so saying you are a firework, and that's where we get our metaphor. So it's saying you are like a firework. Two unlike things, this person they're addressing and the firework. And then we can, if we were sort of explicating this line, we might sort of explain how a person can be like a firework. And Katy Perry is saying that they're so amazing, right? You're in awe of how sort of great this person is as as you sort of show how great you are, your worth as a person. You're amazing, that type of thing. And then the simile that she uses, so do you ever feel so paper thin like a house of cards one blow from caving in? So she's using the word like there, so we know it's a simile, and then she's comparing, or she's asking the question, do you ever feel so paper thin like a house of cards? So paper thin, house of cards, these are sort of figurative language, and the simile of the house of cards, like a house of cards, is used here. So a house of cards is again stacked, a stacked sort of structure that is very fragile. So she's talking about sort of the fragility of this person and what it feels like to be vulnerable. So when you're doing your poetry explication, you can look at individual lines of figurative metaphors, similes, that type of thing. And then also give me your analysis of them. So don't just point them out, explain them in the context of that poem. So some more figurative language that we can look at. So imagery is sort of a catch-all term, but it can be defined as all the sort of sensory details that describe the physical experience. So any sort of imagery that describes the senses, right? So sound, sights, smells, tastes, and the feel of objects. So this would be sort of examples of imagery in poems. So anything that describes or talks about those five senses. And then you might also want to look for symbols. So we had to look for symbols when we were reading fiction, so you also have to do this in poetry. And here I've used the example of the apple from Snow White. And the apple is again a potent symbol in American culture, North American culture, and in society as a whole. And then you think of all the connotations where you might find an apple. So we see this apple in a Disney cartoon. We might think of the apple in the Garden of Eden, which Eve ate, and all the connotations that go along with that apple as a symbol. It's supposed to be sort of wholesome, but it's sort of also temptation, right? It's red. We know red has sort of connotations of sin. Eve was the one who sort of ate from the apple, and this was sort of the original sin in the Bible. So there's a lot of connotations and symbolism of simple things that we can sort of dissect when you're reading into poetry. And the apple is one that's present in this example of Snow White.